Welcome everyone to class number 2 in the series of the S'dei Chemed. We are currently on page Aleph Tafresh Zayin 1607 in the regular standard edition of the S'dei Chemed, which would be the page opposite 1312. In the middle of the right-hand column. To remind everyone, what we're discussing is various different things regarding the Bnei Noach. How and do they in fact apply to Bnei Noach? These are technical, religious, legal things that apply to Jews. So the question is, in the Bnei Noach fulfilling their obligation of the 7 Noachide commandments, how and what do these things apply to? So some of these are short, like the first one we had with just a few lines, and some of them are very long. We're in the middle of the second item, and it's quite lengthy. The topic here is shi'urim, measurements, sizes. Do they apply to the non-Jew or not? Basically, when the Torah, for example, forbids a Jew from eating certain things, whether it's non-kosher food, whether it's chametz, leaven, on Passover, whether it's eating on Yom Kippur. So in order for the Jew to be liable, for it to be punishable, there's a minimal requirement that the Jew must eat in order to get the penalty, the punishment. If he eats less than that, so then he's not punished. So the question is, do these measurements apply to the Bnei Noach when it comes to the things that they can't eat, which is Eiver min hachai, a limb or part of an animal that was detached from the animal while the animal was still living. So we're in the middle of discussing the case of a Jew giving a non-Jew from the Paschal offering, meat of the Karban Pesach, of the Paschal offering. And we quoted the Rambam, Maimonides, and then a much more recent commentary, the Tzlach, on the Rambam. Now we know that every word in Maimonides is extremely precise and exact. So he says, the wording of the Rambam is that it's a prohibition on the Jew to feed a non-Jew from the Paschal offering. And the Rambam mentions kezayis, which is the volume of the amount of food that a Jew is either obligated to eat when it comes to a mitzvah to eat something, such as matzah on Passover, or meat of a Karban Pesach. That's the minimal requirement that the person must eat. Or, in the negative side, in order to transgress, generally speaking, the measurement is also that amount if a Jew is not allowed to eat something. Eating less than a kezayis for a Jew is not considered eating. So again, matzah, the unleavened bread, those crackers that we eat on the night of Passover at the Seder, if a Jew were to consume less than a kezayis, he did not fulfill his obligation of eating matzah. So the Rambam says that a Jew is not allowed to give a non-Jew a kezayis. So we're discussing over here the issue, is it that the Jew can't feed the non-Jew, and therefore it's a kezayis? Or is the prohibition on the non-Jew, that he can't eat from the Paschal offering? So, let's continue from where we're up to. Again, page 3213, right-hand column, in the middle, the new paragraph beginning with the word hein. Hein emes, indeed it's true, the Lashon Rabbeinu b'Sefer HaMitzvahs, that the language of Maimonides in his book of mitzvahs, which is the introductory work to his monumental work of the Mishnah Torah, the Yad HaChazaka. So in a Sefer HaMitzvahs, where he explains generally, briefly, each one of the 613 commandments, he tells you what the commandment is, the biblical sources he quotes, and where in the oral law, in the Talmud, it is discussed. Usually it's one short paragraph per mitzvah, per commandment. So his language there is b'mitzvahs lo yisas siman kuf chav ches. When it comes to prohibition, number 128, negative commandment 128, moire kidimitargim hagoyin tzlach. It does seem to be like the tzlach explains it, namely, shazhara zu hi lahabenei charatzmoi, that this warning, this prohibition, is for the outsider, for the one who's not allowed to eat from the Paschal offering. Where we're talking right now about a Pnei Noyach, about a non-Jew. For that matter, it could also be certain types of Jews, like if the Jew converted out, we said, or for that matter, if the Jew, for whatever reason, is uncircumcised. All those people are not allowed to partake in eating the Paschal offering. So again, Paschal offering has to be eaten. There are a lot of requirements. It's got to be a Jew who is pure, not defiled, not impure. So, and if it's a male, so he has to be circumcised. Anyone else, as far as the Paschal offering, is called a nechar, ben nechar, an outsider. That would include all non-Jews and some Jews, as we just mentioned. So this prohibition is actually on the foreigner, on, let's say, the non-Jew. Shari Kosav, for the Rambam, writes, Mitzvah Kuf Chav Ches, the commandment number 128, Shiz Harnu, that we are warned, Me'achoyla Pesach, Yisrael Shnishtamid Lavedas Kechavim. A Jew who has left the fold, he has categorically converted out to become an idolater. V'hu Amr Yisale, and this is what God, exalted one, blessed be he, says, Kol ben necher lo yichal boy, quoting the verse that any foreigner may not eat from it. V'amar hametargem, and Maimonides here quotes the translator, which is the classic translation of the Torah into Aramaic, from the Holy Tongue, from Hebrew to Aramaic, which is known as the translation of Onkelos. So he says, this is Onkelos's translation / explanation on the verse. Again, the words in the verse are Kol ben nechar lo yoichal boy, which literally means any outsider shall not eat of it. Says Onkelos, Kol bar Yisrael di ishtamed, any or every Jew that will convert out. V'loshen mechilta, and to quote the Mechilta, which is a Talmudic writing, Kol ben nechar, when the verse states any foreigner, ze Yisrael mumar lavodah zara, lavodas kechavim. This refers to a Jew who categorically is an idolater. Ad kan l'shoinoi, up to here is the quote of Maimonides. Hare, so now behold, so we see clearly that Maimonides does in fact speak about this, that he shall not eat, not that you shall not feed. So again, it seems at this point from Maimonides that the prohibition is on the eater, which in this case, let's say that would be the Ben Noyach, that it's the non-Jew that's forbidden, that's warned not to eat from this sacrifice. However, says the S'dei Chemed, it appears that it is in fact a printing error. There's a mistake here. And what it should really read, that we are warned, in other words, the prohibition, the commandment is not to feed, instead of saying not to eat. As is the language of Maimonides in his monumental magnum opus work of the book of the Yad, the Mishnah Torah. See there, which we quoted earlier, it says clearly that it is forbidden, that's how we got into all of this, that it's forbidden for a Jew to give one kizayis of the Paschal offering for a ben nechar. If he does, he's transgressing, but he does not get the floggings, the 39 lashes. So in order for it to be consistent, therefore, we need to say that there is a printing error here in the Sefer HaMitzvahs of the Rambam. And to prove that, back to the Sefer HaMitzvahs, the previous mitzvah, one mitzvah before that, mitzvah number 127 of the negative, of the prohibitions, there it says that we are not allowed to feed of the Paschal offering to the uncircumcised. And this is what God states, and any or every or all uncircumcised shall not eat from it. And an uncircumcised individual, talking about a Jew who's not circumcised, if he does eat from it, then he does get the floggings. Up to here is the language of the Rambam in commandment number 127. So there's no reason to make a distinction between the prohibition of feeding it to an uncircumcised person or to a person who's an idolater. It is certainly a printing error. And what it should really read, that we are prohibited from eating the Paschal offering, the uncircumcised, that the prohibition, of course, is on the uncircumcised person himself. And what do we mean by an uncircumcised Jew? So the classic example is that it's an individual whose older brothers who preceded him died due to the circumcision, and therefore he was not allowed to be circumcised. His mother had one son that was circumcised and died because of that, and then a second son died as well, and therefore this one is not to be circumcised. Or another example would be that this person is a sinner when it comes to the commandment of circumcision. His parents didn't circumcise him, and when he got older, he did not have himself circumcised. And he's not circumcising himself because of the pain, the tremendous discomfort that there is in circumcising himself. So just as there is a mistake in commandment number, in the printing of commandment number 127, and it should say that he is prohibited from eating instead of saying feeding. So too, the opposite mistake fell into commandment number 128. That it should say there that we're warned from feeding, etc. Instead of eating. As he writes in commandment number 126. That we are prohibited, the Jew is prohibited, from feeding the ger toishav, which is a non-Jew, etc. That it is the warning on the feeder. So, let's just put a little bit in order over here. When it comes to the negative commandments, the prohibitions relating to the eating of the Paschal offering. So we have, according to the list, the way the Rambam counts it, we have commandment number 126, which is the Jew is forbidden to give of the Paschal offering, to feed it to a ger toishav. A ger toishav, which we've discussed, and we've had classes a while ago at length. Basically, a ger toishav is the highest level and the highest form of a non-Jew. The word ger itself lends us to mistranslate it as convert, because one who becomes Jewish, a non-Jew that converts, is called a ger tzedek in rabbinic literature. So ger toishav is the highest form of a non-Jew. He's not Jewish. And although he has many rights, and he lives in the land of Israel, etc., nonetheless, prohibition number 126 is for the Jew to give of the Paschal offering to the ger toishav to eat. Okay? Then prohibition number 127, the next one, is that it's not allowed for a non-circumcised Jew to eat from it. So the question again is it for him to eat? So we're saying no. What it really should say is it's forbidden. Well, the question is it forbidden for the Jew to feed him, or is it forbidden for him to eat it? And then you have number 128, that the prohibition against a Jew that is an idolater. So again, is it that we're not allowed to feed it to him, or that he's not allowed to eat it? So the question is, what's the focus? Because we really are trying to deal with the language, and it's not just the language, but it's very crucial. In the Sefer Hayad, in the Mishnah Torah, where Maimonides elaborates, doesn't just list the commandments. So there he says clearly that the Jew is, if a Jew feeds a kezayis, that amount, to a non-Jew, he is transgressing. So obviously Maimonides is not contradicting himself. So therefore, when it comes to the Sefer HaMitzvahs, works the same way. That when it comes to the non-Jew, the ger toishav, let's say, so it's also that we're not allowed to feed him. So in order to make it all work out, he's suggesting that there must be a printing error in both 127 and in 128. That in 128, what it should really say that when one is uncircumcised, the prohibition is on that uncircumcised Jew, that he may not eat from it, not on the feeder. And in 127, where we're talking about the idolater, Likewise, he may not eat it. And it's only in 128 where the prohibition is from feeding instead of eating. So basically, we're correcting 127 and 128. Now, I just want to add over here, mind you, that Maimonides wrote his Mishneh Torah, known as the Chazaka, which is the 14 books where he goes through all of Jewish law. He wrote that originally in Lashon HaKodesh. So, again, depending on going back to the manuscripts, depending which printing edition, how accurate, etc., the language is exactly Maimonides' language. It's not a translation. It's the only work of Maimonides which the original is in Hebrew. Everything else that he wrote, including the Sefer HaMitzvahs that we're talking about now, which includes Prohibition 126 and 127 and 128, he wrote that in Arabic originally. And it was translated into Hebrew. So a lot can be lost in the translation, so therefore it's more possible for a printing error or a typo or a misusage of a term to happen when it's not even the original language in the first place. So in any case, what we're trying to say right now is that, according to Maimonides, the prohibition is on the Jew to feed the non-Jew, because otherwise we have a problem with why Maimonides says a kezayis. If I'm talking about feeding a non-Jew, so why a kezayis? Kezayis is for the Jew. But since I'm not focusing on the non-Jew who's eating, I'm focusing on the Jew who's feeding, therefore we say kezayis. All right. Right-hand column at the bottom. Umatzasi. Now this is the S'dei Chemed speaking. Umatzasi, and I found, shekvar omad harav mitzvahs Hashem, the parshas boy, al divrei hagoyin tzlach, yishteit miyus hanal. Says I found that a particular rabbi, in his commentary, actually quotes the words of the tzlach that we're dealing with the above mentioned two questions. Namely, we're going to now mention them again. We had this last class. Aleph A, question number 1. Lama hitzrich Rambam kezayis? Why does the Rambam in his Mishnah Torah, in the laws of the Paschal offering, in chapter 9, why does he require, in order for the Jew to transgress, why does he require him to give the non-Jew a kezayis, that amount? The measurements were not given to the non-Jews, like we discussed. For a non-Jew, it's punishable even if he eats the smallest amount. So why does Maimonides say that the Jew is transgressing if he feeds him a kezayis? B. From the fact that Maimonides counts this commandment of not feeding a non-Jew in his list of the 613 commandments, but if you're going to say that it's a prohibition for the non-Jew, that he's not allowed to eat from the Paschal offering, then it would not be fitting for it to be one of the 613. The 613 are clearly commandments to the Jew. Because that is a particular commandment for the non-Jew, not for the Jew at all. So how can you count it as one of the 613? According to the tzlach that he is learning in the words of the Rambam, that we're talking to the non-Jew, that he has a personal prohibition against eating from the Paschal offering, and yet it says kazayis. And just to remind you from last time, so if that's the case, so why aren't there 8 Noahide commandments? One of them is that he can't eat from the Paschal offering. Why is it only 7? And this is not one of them. So that the tzlach dealt with by saying, because it doesn't apply all the time. First of all, it's only once a year, and secondly, it's only when there's a temple, when you have the Paschal offering. Whereas the other 7 are universal in all times and all places. So he says, therefore, yes, it's true, it is an 8th commandment, but it's not counted as 8. But now we're saying, no, doesn't make sense. Again, for one reason, why is there a kazayis mentioned if it's on the non-Jew? And number 2, how could this prohibition of a non-Jew eating from the Paschal offering be counted as one of the 613? You can't say, well, he's not allowed to eat from it, so therefore I can't feed it to him. That's a separate discussion in a sense of what we mentioned, lifnei iver lesitin michshel, that you're not allowed to put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. That's a separate issue. That you can't cause someone else to transgress. That's a very general prohibition. But here we're not saying that the Jew is transgressing that by feeding it to him. Maimonides says that the Jew is transgressing this prohibition of every foreigner may not eat from this by feeding it to him. So we see that it is a prohibition on the Jew, not on the non-Jew. Elavadai, rather, certainly, muchach mizeh, it is clearly proven from this, that the warning, the prohibition is on the Jewish feeder. As is the implication of the language of the Rambam, where he says that the Jew who feeds a kezayis to the non-Jew is transgressing a negative commandment. But he doesn't spell out, Maimonides doesn't say which negative commandment it is. Dehainu, meaning which commandment is it? Lo yisaseh ha'amur b'inyan korban pesach. It's the prohibition which is mentioned with regards to the Paschal offering, that a non-Jew may not eat from it. That's one of the 613 commandments, meaning a Jew is forbidden to give of the Paschal offering to a non-Jew. V'oid, and furthermore, the mashi yishiv hagoyin tzlach, that which this genius, the tzlach, explained, he answered, L'shitasoi, according to his understanding, that the prohibition that Maimonides is talking about is on the non-Jew. The fact that this commandment of not eating from the Paschal offering, why isn't it listed on the commandments for the Bnei Noach, for the non-Jews, is one of their commandments. So as we just explained, that Tzlach said that, and the reason why it's not mentioned as one of the 7, or why don't we make it an 8th, because it's only once a year, and it's only when you have a Paschal offering, so since it's not constant, therefore it's not technically one of those. So that explanation, to me, Hali, is bewildering to me. How does such an explanation calm the mind of this great sage, of this great genius? That although that explanation will explain why the sages list that there are 7 commandments and not 8, that we will say that the fact that it's not the same as the other 7, therefore it's not included in the 7. so therefore they say 7, not 8. That's true. The other 7 have in common that they apply in all places at all times. That's true. And therefore, it's not counted. But if indeed, if it's true that the non-Jew is commanded that he's not allowed to eat from this meat, Maimonides should have written this ruling, this law, clearly and explicitly, that the non-Jew that eats from the Paschal offering, if he eats that meat, is liable. Shneemar, and then quote the verse, Kol ben neichar lo yechal boy, that every foreigner, every non-Jew, should not eat from it. And automatically we would know the Yisrael amachiloi oiver belifnei iver lo yisitin michshel, that when a Jew feeds it to him, obviously the Jew is transgressing. Which transgression? Of don't put a stumbling block before a blind person. Sheben noyach chayav alav. Just as the Rambam says clearly, when it comes to the prohibition of eating Eiver min achai, eating meat or a limb or a part of an animal that was detached when the animal was still living. So, in the laws of kings, which is where Maimonides speaks primarily about the Sheva mitzvahs, the 7 commandments, chapter 9, ruling number 10, there Rambam writes clearly that a ben noyach is liable for eating Eiver min achai, v'loi kosav, and he did not write over there that the Jew that hands it to the non-Jew, that he gives him this meat of the Eiver min achai, is transgressing. Doesn't write that. That he's transgressing this idea of putting a stumbling block before a blind person. Or at the very least, here in the laws of the Paschal offering, Maimonides should have at least written that the Jew that feeds the non-Jew is transgressing lifnei iver, putting a stumbling block in front of a blind person, instead of just saying that he's transgressing. Because if you say it like that, that would have clearly implied that the non-Jew is transgressing eating it. So Maimonides could have said, and if this is in fact what he meant, then he should have said that the Jew that gives the non-Jew of the Paschal offering is transgressing putting a stumbling block before a blind person, which would have clearly implied that, and the non-Jew who eats of it is transgressing this prohibition of don't eat from, that a non-Jew should not eat from it. Maimonides doesn't say that. He just says that the Jew that gives a kezayis to the non-Jew is transgressing the loisaseh, the prohibition. Doesn't say which prohibition. V'oid ikar hatam shekos v'agoin. And furthermore, the main reason that the Tzlach writes, Al mashaloi nimnis azharazu, that the reason why this commandment, this warning, is not listed Bahadei Sheva Mitzvos Bnei Noach, amongst the 7 Noachite commandments, Mishum she'eino noheges ela pamachas b'shana v'chulu, because it's only once a year, and it's only when we have the Paschal offering, so therefore it's not like the other 7, so therefore it's not listed. Bilhurmunuse demar, with all due respect to the master, to this great sage, the Tzlach, says the S'dei Chemed, Einoi tam lishvach. That explanation, that reasoning, is not a good explanation. Sharei gabi Yisrael luminin atayag mitzvahs yesh kama mitzvahs she'noyagois kim pam b'shana. When it comes to the Jews, out of the 613 commandments, the Jews are commanded, all the do's and the don'ts. Many of them are only once a year. Umeyen pam beyovel. And some of them are literally once every 50 years. Some of the commandments of the 613 only apply once every 50 years, the Jubilee year. And they are counted as some of the 613 for the Jews. So why should we not count this one for the Bnei Noach? I understand that Jews and the commandments that God gives the Jewish people in the Torah are obviously different than the universal commandments that the Bnei Noach are given. But if out of the 613, many of them cannot apply on a constant, regular basis, many of them are only once a year, or even once in 50 years, so what's wrong with saying that the commandments that the non-Jews have, the Bnei Noach, some of them, or one of them, is also such a mitzvah that can only apply in a certain situation and only at most once a year. And let them be 8. Not the 7 Noachide commandments. Let it be the 8 Noachide commandments. And number 8 will be that they may not eat from the Paschal offering. Because they are commanded. God says they may not eat from it. It's like all of his commandments. What's the difference? Even though they're all not exactly the same. Who cares? So 7 of them apply at any given time. Not to kill, not to steal. Has nothing to do with what date or what season it is or what country we live in. Fine. And one of them can only apply on Passover if we have a Paschal offering. So what? When it comes to the Jews, we count 613, even though there's so many differences between one commandment and the next. Who cares? It still counts as 613. So why can't we say, when it comes to the non-Jew, same thing. Whatever they're not allowed to do is a mitzvah, is a commandment. And instead of 7, let it be 8. So he doesn't accept, he's challenging the tzlach explanation. So basically, at this point, we are making the argument that we're rejecting the tzlach, the way he understands the Rambam. And we are stating that in the Rambam, when he says that a Jew may not feed a non-Jew of the Paschal offering, a kezayis, then he's transgressing. We are clearly speaking about the Jew, and it's a prohibition upon the Jew, and he would be the sinner, not the non-Jew who's eating it. It would be the Jew's sin. And what sin is it? Not merely the sin of don't put a stumbling block in front of someone. No, this is the prohibition, that the Jew may not allow or give or feed the non-Jew. And then we understand why he says kezayis, because that only makes sense if it's a Jew. It's a kezayis because it's a sin on the Jew. For the non-Jew, you wouldn't say kezayis. If a Jew would give half a kezayis to a non-Jew, he would still be transgressing, because you're focusing on the non-Jew. How much is he not allowed to eat? Any amount. Okay, so then when I feed him, it would be any amount. We are now on the left-hand column, top left. Should we see that is? Left-hand column, the beginning of the new paragraph with the word vihine. Vihine b'sefer hanal. So in the above-mentioned sefer, the above-mentioned book that the S'dei Chemed said that he saw, Kosav, he wrote, Liyashiv kushiyosei hanal, in order to answer his above-mentioned question against the tzlach. V'zel l'shoynoi, and we quote, V'nire davar chodosh, and it appears that we now have a new idea here, namely, she'isur achilas pesach, that the prohibition of eating from the Paschal offering, the meat of the Paschal offering, nishtana mikol isuri b'nei noach, is different than all of the other Noahide prohibitions. All the other, well, I would say 7, but one of them is a positive commandment, so the other 6 of the 7. This one of not eating from the Paschal offering is different. Lihiyois tzarich boy shiur leben noyach k'moy liYisrael. In this particular commandment, there has to be a shiur, an amount, a measurement, the volume of a kezayis, just like for a Jew. Unlike the other things. For example, Eiver min hachai, eating part of an animal which was detached from the animal when the animal was still living, that would be any amount. But eating from the Paschal offering, in this case, for the Ben Noyach, for the non-Jew, it would be like a Jew, kezayis. And why would that be so? Why are we making it different for the Ben Noyach? So the logic is as follows. What is the basis for God in the Torah forbidding the non-Jew of partaking and eating of this Paschal offering? Because it is designated solely for the Jew. Only a Jew may partake. And like we said, not even every Jew can eat from it. If he's uncircumcised, he can't eat from it. So the whole point of the Paschal offering, why the non-Jew can't eat it, is because it is clearly designated for the Jew only. And since it is improper to touch that which is special, which has been designated, and it's meant for someone else, therefore, it would be that the non-Jew can't eat the amount that the Jew would have to eat, which is a kezayis. And take a look in the Midrash, where it says as follows. Quoting the verse in the book of Exodus, where God says to Moses and Aaron, this is the law of the Passover, of the Paschal offering. So the Midrashic interpretation there is that every individual knows the bitterness of their own heart, and when they rejoice, so that no one else can mix in. Meaning, the Kavan Shabbat says, when it came time for the Jewish nation to leave bondage, slavery of Egypt, and in connection with the exodus from Egypt, God decreed that the Jewish people have to bring a special sacrifice, bring the Paschal offering. Bo HaMitzrayim lechol imohem. Came along the Egyptians to eat along with them. They wanted to participate. Amru lahem v'chulu. They said to them, etc. Uvesimchasa le'yisarev zar. Ad kan l'shoinei. And in their rejoicing, no one else can eat. Basically, to paraphrase, the Midrash is saying that those that suffered are the ones that are going to rejoice. So it's inappropriate for someone who didn't really suffer to come along now and tag along and be part of the rejoicing. So since it was particularly the Hebrews, the Jewish people that were enslaved, and therefore as part of the redemptive celebration and process, the night before we leave Egypt, we are to participate in eating a special Paschal offering. Therefore, there's no room for anyone else to join the party. Okay? Vilachein, and therefore, ein bein neichar oiver al azharas v'chol bein neichar lo yichal boi, kim boich lo shiur asher Yisrael hayu yacholatzis bo yedei chayvasoi. V'hu kezayis. Therefore, the non-Jew does not transgress. He's not transgressing of eating from the Paschal offering unless it's an amount that the Jew would have fulfilled his obligation. So this is a unique type of a commandment. And since the Jew has to eat at least a kezayis, and less than the kezayis for the Jew doesn't count, therefore, in order for the non-Jew to transgress and to do something wrong, he would too need to eat a kezayis, even though he's not Jewish, and it's a particular measurement. Because only then is he actually inappropriately affecting or touching something which is designated for someone else. A kezayis is designated for a Jew, and therefore the non-Jew has no right to it. Less than a kezayis, that's not the amount that's designated for the Jew, and therefore the non-Jew is not technically doing anything wrong. He's not transgressing. All right, that's the end of the quote of this particular sefer, the book that we quoted. The S'dei Chemed continues, and he says that this individual wrote over there, Shagam echad mi mefarshei sefer Mishnah Torah lo yeiris makar divrei Rambam shelo nitnu shiurim livnei Noach. Not one of the commentators on Maimonides has brought up what is the source of Maimonides to state that measurements were not given to the Bnei Noach, to the non-Jews. So he explains, you know why? Because you don't need any specific source. You don't have to have a source for stating that these measurements were not given to the Bnei Noach. Kinilmad ma'yadua lanu. It is derived from that which we know, shechatzi shir asur min haTorah. Eating less than the prescribed amount that one would not be allowed to eat is also biblically forbidden. That's a whole discussion, and the Talmud does state clearly. For example, let's say the prohibition for a Jew to eat non-kosher is 1 kezayis. All right, that's the amount. And just for argument's sake or whatever, let's just assume that that's an ounce. Let's say it's an ounce. That is the amount that if a Jew eats, the punishment is whatever the punishment is for that particular prohibition. Okay. What about eating half a kezayis, half an ounce? So even though he won't get the punishment, spiritual punishment, or whether it's the punishment that the court would administer, whatever it is, there's no punishment. But the prohibition does exist. It's not allowed. It is still forbidden, but there's no penalty. That's what we say with regards to the Jew. V'im kain. So if so, gam liyisrael nitnu hashiurim, eloin shim bilvad. So it comes out that if you want to put it in these terms, even for the Jew, the measurements were not given. Only for punishment, for the penalty, not for the prohibition. Aval azhara, but when it comes to the warning, to the prohibition, yesh gam al kol shehu. It even applies to the most minute amount, to one morsel. And therefore, makes perfect sense, logically, there are no such measurements for the non-Jewish world. Because when it comes to Bnei Noach, just as they don't need any warning, because their warning is their death penalty, which is a whole discussion for itself, where we say that by Bnei Noach, for them to transgress any one of their 7, it's a capital offense. And do they have to be warned properly as a Jew needs to be warned when he transgresses one of his capital offenses? No. So the same thing, the whole thing is different, because the punishment by the non-Jew, by the Ben Noach, is different. But as far as the measurements, there's no difference. So the measurements were also not given for the Jew. Now it says in S'dei Chemed that this particular author actually really did very, very well. It's a very good observation that he's making by stating that none of the commentators on Maimonides, on the Rambam, mentioned where the source of Maimonides is for the measurements. But surely there are many authors that do speak about it. And then he just lists in the parentheses, Ayin b'shalas tshuvas Bris Yaakov, Chaim Siman Chafalef, Amuva, Lahalon, Besif Katan Yudalit. He says later on, much later, he's going to bring that down. And now we're going to quote one of the commentators on the Jewish Code of Law, and the name of his book is the Pri Megadim, Besifrei Ginas Veradim, one of his books, Klal Memhei, Al Svaras HaRambam Hanal, where this Pri Megadim, on this Rambam, he writes as follows, V'lo yodaiti, now I don't know, Me'ayin Mokoim Moitzoy, where he finds it from. Where does Maimonides get this from? Meaning that there are no measurements by non-Jews, by the prohibition for non-Jews. Ulefi ma shekasav Mishnah lo Melech barisha in Milchas Chametz b'shem hara'am the Rabbi Yochanan the Chatzi Shir Asur min HaTorah stam achilahi b'chol shehu v'asya hilchasa v'afiktei lo einshin lekazayis tafka im kein leben noyach hasvara neisenes sheharig b'chol shehu. So he says, he brings down a source which explains that according to the opinion in the Talmud, that eating less than the kezayis, half a kezayis, which doesn't have to be literally half, any fraction, eating less than the kezayis is still biblically prohibited, because when you speak about eating, that's any amount. Any amount is called eating. It's only with regards to the punishment that it needs to be a kezayis, and therefore by non-Jews, since they get punished by death for any transgression of any of their seven, therefore it makes sense that for them it's the smallest amount, even much less than a kezayis. Because they don't have this oral tradition of a certain amount is when they get punished. As long as they transgress, they get the punishment. V'shapir kosav harambam d'chol ashirin hem liyisro. And therefore the Rambam wrote very well, very nicely, and very correctly that all of the measurements are solely for the Jew. Ach l'masha kosav Mishnah l'melech sham de l'reish lakish d'chatzi shir mutar min HaTorah stam achila muskar bikra hi bekazayis im ken gam ben noyach ein neherag umuzar ela bekazayis l'reish lakish. Problem is, in the Talmud, there's actually a dispute between two of the Talmudic sages. What we said until now is the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says that half of a kezayis is biblically forbidden. However, his contemporary, Reish Lakish, he states that actually, biblically speaking, eating less than a kezayis is permitted. A Jew would be allowed to eat less than a kezayis of pork, biblically speaking. Which means that according to Reish Lakish, the definition of eating is only a kezayis. And whenever the Torah says one shall not eat something, it means a kezayis. If so, if that's the definition of eating, then it would apply to Bnei Noyach. And a Bnei Noyach would not be put to death for eating less than a kezayis of whatever they can't eat. V'i nema de Reish Lakish, shestam achila b'chol shu, v'ilchasa af kesei l'Reish Lakish, af li'isura de b'inin kezayis, im kin gam l'Reish Lakish b'Noyach muzar v'nerag al kol shu. To the gabei leis ilchasa. But nonetheless, when even according to Reish Lakish, that eating is any small amount, but that itself is only a tradition that we have. But when it comes to the prohibition, you still need to have a kezayis, so even Reish Lakish would agree that a ben noyach is forewarned, and he would be put to death for eating any amount, because they don't have these halackas, this oral tradition going back that God gave to Moses. So therefore, what we're going to say is like this. Both Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish agree that when you say eat, the definition of eating something is at least a kezayis. The only difference is, according to Rabbi Yochanan, the oral tradition, going back to God telling Moses orally, is that even though the kezayis is called eating, and less than that is not technically eating, yet God says if the person had less than that amount, they still are transgressing. And Reish Lakish does not hold of that. Or he gives another suggestion that how do we know that when the Torah says you can't eat something, it's any amount? It's because of a specific wording in one of the verses where it says that a Jew is not to eat any chelev, which is non-kosher fats. So he uses the word kol, all, or any amount. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, that's the actual verse we learned from. And according to Reish Lakish, no, it's all still oral tradition, but that verse is just what we call asmachta, which is a Talmudic term for when something is part of the oral tradition, but yet the rabbis found a word or a verse to be able to sort of support that. But in essence, it's part of the oral tradition. We still don't know why would a Ben Noach be different, and why is he obligated, and why is he liable for any amount. Hincha roya shekvar omad bazeh agoyin v'kosav diashiv hu hatzad kam etzodim umasik b'tzorchiyun. So you do see that someone did bring up this subject, and he explains it in various different ways. And he concludes, though, with a tzarich iyun, which basically means that we're leaving it still, and we're not satisfied with the explanation. So we do see that it is an issue. Why is it that there are no shiurim, that there's no specific measurement when it comes to the Bnei Noach? But that is the point. We're just trying to understand what is the source for that. So we are going to stop at this point. And as I mentioned, that this second topic of the Shiur of Bnei Noach is very lengthy, so it's going to take us a while. And to be continued from this point. And in the meantime, wishing everybody much success in the study and in the observance and promoting the 7 Noachide commandments and making this world, the godly world, with the complete revelation of Mashiach now. Thank you.